Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander through the frost-bitten streets of Leningrad, feeling the crunch of snow under your worn boots and the hollow echo of an empty stomach. Because we're exploring a world where a loaf of bread was literally worth more than gold. And yes, you probably won't survive this, at least not without a vivid imagination. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me your location and local time in the comments. It's strangely comforting to know who else is awake with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's September 1941. You trudge past shuttered windows and frost-coated streets. The air is sharp enough to sting your lungs, carrying the scent of smoke and something else. Hunger, mainly. You've read that the German siege of Leningrad is legendary, but the reality is chilling citizens reduced to nibbling wallpaper paste and animal feed just to stay alive. A loaf of bread, weighing a mere 125 grams, could cost more than gold, if you could even find one. And here you are, lining up with hundreds of neighbors, all staring at ration cards like they're lottery tickets. You remember your grandmother muttering about black bread when she was a child. Now, the term isn't a metaphor. It's rye and sawdust baked together, dry enough to crack teeth, but soft enough to keep you moving another day. Historians still argue whether some of these extreme substitutions, like powdered cellulose or crushed tree bark, actually prolonged life or just made survival slightly more bearable. In any case, your stomach growls like a bad joke that no one's laughing at. The city has turned strange. Even the architecture seems hungry. The buildings lean under snow and neglect. Guards patrol the streets with rifles, but not for your safety there, protecting what little food is left. The rationing system is meticulous. Paper defines existence here. 125 grams of bread per adult per day. A ration card, stamped and scrutinized like sacred scripture. You feel a twinge of disbelief. Back home, you complain if your sandwich doesn't have enough peanut butter. Here, you would trade your coat for a crust, and someone might just take it. Quirky things happen in desperate times. You notice a small line of cats, their fur clumped with ice, waiting near a bakery. Someone tosses them scraps, and for a moment, survival feels shared. In fact, some families during the siege considered cats as miniature grocery stores, feeding them extra scraps, ensured you wouldn't starve when pet rations ran out. Yes, you read that right. Pet food becomes a literal life insurance policy. Women dominate the queues, their faces pale but resolute, carrying toddlers wrapped in whatever fabric they could find. You can almost hear their inner monologue. If I survive this, I will never waste a meal again. Some children wander, wide-eyed, scavenging bits of coal to burn for warmth. You remind yourself that even though modern sources romanticize endurance, the actual day-to-day grind is exhausting, terrifying, and painfully slow. Every bite of black bread is a triumph. Every empty plate is a minor apocalypse. Yet, even amid despair, small victories appear. You spot a neighbor sharing a sardine tin, a tin so small that its contents could barely feed one person, but its generosity in miniature. Historians still debate how acts of communal sharing influenced survival rates during the siege. Did kindness truly prolong life, or was it mostly a psychological crutch? You'll never know fully, but watching someone offer their crumbs sparks a flicker of hope. You trudge on past the frozen Neva River, imagining the ferries and ice roads that try to bring food into the city. It's surreal to consider that a few sacks of grain, sliding across ice, could sustain tens of thousands for a day. You hear murmurs of supply lines and ration cards being mismanaged, whispers about who got extra today and who got nothing. Every transaction, every loaf, every ration card is now the currency of existence, more precious than gold or silver or even jewelry. The city's soundscape is different too. No children laughing in playgrounds, no street musicians, just the wind scraping snow against brick, punctuated by the distant bark of dogs or the soft thud of someone collapsing from weakness. You notice it, feel it, taste it on your tongue like ashes, and then you move on, because movement is survival. Sitting still is surrender, and surrender here is unthinkable. Night approaches. You huddle in a small apartment, sharing a single loaf between 4 people. The bread is dry and coarse, but you chew slowly, savoring what the rest of the world might dismiss as inedible. Outside, the city waits, indifferent yet watchful. Each day is a negotiation with hunger, cold, and exhaustion, a relentless game. Of inches, you take a deep breath, exhale, and realize that tonight you survived. Tomorrow, the lottery begins again. Winter hits like a sledgehammer in Leningrad. You wake to frost-laced windows and icicles hanging like jagged teeth from the eaves, and the sky is an unbroken gray. The snow isn't soft, it's abrasive, crunching underfoot with a kind of sharpness that makes your teeth chatter involuntarily. You tug your thin coat tighter around you, but you know it won't help much. The cold seeps into your bones, and no amount of wool seems sufficient. Outside, the streets are a maze of frozen mud and frozen desperation. A surreal monochrome landscape where each breath fogs in the air and each movement costs precious energy. Hunger gnaws at you constantly. It's not just an absence of food, it's an all-encompassing companion. Even when you're distracted, the growl of your stomach reminds you of what's missing. Ordinary survival habits from your past, snacking while walking, a warm breakfast, a slice of fruit, a laughable. Memories. You pinch your stomach, willing it to stop complaining. While your mind races with calculations, a loaf of bread, if you can find one, might feed you for a day, maybe 2. And sometimes, even that is a gamble. The cold amplifies scarcity. Water freezes in pipes, and heating is limited to what little firewood the city can scrounge. Children walk to school or what passes for school with red cheeks and stiff limbs, their tiny boots squeaking across the ice. Mothers carry babies wrapped in blankets so thin they might as well be tissue paper. You notice the inventive ways people try to survive. Newspapers stuffed into clothing for insulation, coal embers kept in tin cans to warm hands, and the occasional scarf repurposed as a sleeping mat. Even during such brutal conditions, human adaptability surprises you. Families stretch rations with ingenuity bordering on desperation. One neighbor talks about mixing barley husks into bread dough to add weight, a trick that might make a loaf stretch a little longer. Historians still debate whether these substitutions actually improved caloric intake or simply filled bellies psychologically. Either way, people cling to the ritual of eating, because ritual is a quiet rebellion against the chaos outside. Quirky adaptations are everywhere. You notice the odd fact that people sometimes boiled leather boots or belts into a slurry they would pretend was soup. It's disgusting by today's standards, but the body adapts. Your stomach has an unsettling capacity for acceptance when you have no choice. Someone whispers that rats occasionally appeared on the menu, their flavor described as nutty by those who survived. It's hard to imagine, but here, imagination bends to reality. and reality is ruthless. The social dynamics of winter hunger are complicated. You watch groups of neighbors share scraps with strangers. A small act, a piece of bread, or a handful of seeds might save a life or build a bond strong enough to withstand the frost. Yet there's tension too. Lines grow longer each day, tempers fray, and minor disputes over crumbs can erupt into shouting matches. Food scarcity is a silent law of survival, one that governs behavior more effectively than any soldier or bureaucrat. Despite deprivation, some routines persist. Children attempt games in the snow, their laughter brief but piercing, a stark contrast to the somber faces of adults. You see someone carving a small sled from leftover wood, a fleeting moment of joy in a city that seems to have forgotten the concept. Scholars still argue whether such moments of play had a measurable impact on morale or were simply psychological distractions, though you feel instinctively that they mattered enormously, even if only for a few fleeting minutes of humanity. The environment itself becomes a character in this drama. Wind slices down streets like a sharpened blade, and snowdrifts form walls around houses, creating both protection and isolation. You trudge through alleyways, recognizing landmarks only by memory. Many buildings have succumbed to neglect or partial collapse. Yet even as the cold dominates, you find brief warmth in communal living. Neighbors huddle near stoves, share whispers of hope, and offer what little they have. Food, when it appears, is both miracle and burden. You get a ration of black bread, the kind made from a mixture of rye and cellulose, so hard and dry that it hurts your teeth. You bite carefully, savoring each crumb, knowing that this small loaf represents survival for the next 24 hours. You recall reading about children being given only 250 grams of bread per day during peak famine. The thought tightens your chest, but it also gives you perspective. Here, quantity is irrelevant. It is sustenance itself that is precious. By nightfall, the cold intensifies. You sit near a dim fire, sharing stories and half-memories with neighbors, trading information about rumored supplies or distant relatives. Even as exhaustion creeps in, there's a silent acknowledgement that you're all in this together. Winter is a merciless teacher, but it's also a catalyst for ingenuity, cooperation, and, in small, quiet ways, hope. You fall asleep with the taste of bread lingering in your mouth and the icy wind whispering through the cracks, knowing that tomorrow the struggle continues, unyielding and immediate. The black market emerges almost as soon as scarcity tightens its grip. You move through shadowed alleyways, hearing whispered deals in hushed tones. One loaf of bread for a watch. Someone hisses, their eyes darting like birds avoiding predators. Here, the city has a second economy, one that runs parallel to ration cards and official bureaucracy, and it's terrifying in its efficiency. People trade everything imaginable: a coat, a tin of condensed milk, a few matches, even family heirlooms. Each transaction feels like walking a tightrope, because getting caught means both the loss of goods and the risk of imprisonment. Yet, hunger makes these trades almost inevitable. You notice the absurdity of some deals. A single sausage, if you could find one, might be worth a week's ration of bread. Candied sugaran, almost mythical luxuries, bartered for wool socks or a single candle. Historians still argue whether the black market in Leningrad significantly undermined Soviet control or whether it was merely a survival mechanism that officials tolerated quietly. For you, standing in the shadows and watching a young woman trade a silver spoon for a crust of bread, the debate feels irrelevant. Survival trumps ideology. Quirky details abound. People sometimes fashioned miniature scales from scraps of metal to measure flour or sugar precisely, because even a gram mattered when it could mean another mouthful of sustenance. There are tales of residents melting down bits of candle wax to form tiny coins to trade, an improvised currency born from necessity. It's incredible and slightly hilarious to imagine someone haggling over wax discs as if negotiating in a posh marketplace in Paris, yet the stakes couldn't be higher. Children adapt to this strange dichotomy towards you see them running errands for older neighbors, carrying tiny bundles of flour or dried fish, their tiny hands frostbitten but determined. Sometimes they trade small personal items, buttons, scraps of cloth, or even drawings for morsels of bread. It's a microcosm of the adult world, a harsh apprenticeship in survival. And yet, even these exchanges carry a semblance of normality, a bridge between the innocence they've lost and the skills they must acquire. The official rationing system and the black market exist side by side in a tense, uneasy balance. You carry your ration card everywhere, knowing it can keep you alive. Yet you also know that ingenuity, trading scraps, bartering favors, can extend survival in ways official channels cannot. The contrast is stark. Bureaucracy defines what you deserve, while the black market dictates what you can actually obtain. And the irony isn't lost on anyone. Sometimes the loaf you get through official channels is smaller than what you can procure with a few coins or a piece of silver from your grandmother's jewelry box. Stories of bold black market exploits circulate constantly. Someone traded a parrot for a sack of grain. Yes, a talking bird, more valuable than gold in this context. Another tale tells of a man who carried flour inside hollowed-out boots to avoid detection, risking frostbite and arrest in the same breath. You can't help but admire the sheer audacity, though you also understand that desperation makes heroes and fools of everyone equally. Scholars still debate how these personal acts of ingenuity shaped public morale. Did they provide hope, or did they exacerbate envy and tension among those who had nothing to trade? You notice the social complexity as well. The black market isn't purely exploitative. Neighbors sometimes share their trades, offering a bit of bread to someone too weak to participate in the deals themselves. A sense of community persists in the strangest places. A merchant might insist on giving a little extra flour to an elderly widow, or a family might quietly pass along a small ration to a child on their way to school. These small acts are lifelines, invisible threads of humanity weaving through a city that could easily have descended entirely into chaos. The psychological toll is significant. You watch faces pale with hunger, hands trembling as they count coins or ration stamps, and you feel the strain in your own body and mind. Hunger isn't just a physical sensation, it's a constant negotiation with fear, shame, and hope. And yet, the black market provides a semblance of control. When you can trade, barter, or negotiate, you reclaim a small measure of agency in a world where every day is dominated by scarcity and cold. Curiously, some black market goods are utterly useless from a practical standpoint, but invaluable socially. A brightly colored scarf, almost impossible to find, can be bartered for several days' worth of bread. Trinkets, buttons, pieces of cloth, teeny remnants of a pre-war life become negotiable commodities. You observe that these items carry more than material value. They're symbols of dignity and memory, pieces of normalcy in a world where normality has been obliterated. The city itself seems to conspire with the black market. Broken windows, empty warehouses, and shuttered bakeries become arenas for clandestine trade. At night, You follow shadows past deserted streets, the fog curling around lampposts like ghosts. The air smells faintly of smoke, coal, and desperation. Occasionally, you glimpse someone negotiating over a stolen loaf at the edge of an alley, their breath fogging in the freezing night. There's tension, suspense, and a darkly humorous absurdity in watching adults argue over a slice of bread as if it were the most precious artifact in the universe. Despite the grim circumstances, the black market also offers lessons in human resilience. People adapt, invent, and improvise in ways that amaze you. Someone might turn a tin can into a measuring cup, or a scrap of wood into a sled to transport food. The ingenuity displayed is both practical and symbolic. It asserts life in a context where death is never far away. Scholars still debate whether these acts were purely survivalist, or if they also fostered a subtle sense of rebellion against the rigid structures imposed by wartime bureaucracy. Perhaps it was both. You begin to notice patterns, the same families, the same small traders, and the same alleyways appear repeatedly. The black market is both a safety net and a social network. Each trade is a story, a microtransaction that carries both immediate sustenance and long-term social implications. Some people are hated, some admired, some trade ethically, others exploit weakness. It's an ecosystem governed by hunger, ingenuity, and human emotion. A microcosm of the larger struggle playing out across Leningrad. By the end of the day, you have witnessed dozens of exchanges, small and large. Each trade is a gamble. The wrong move could mean exposure, theft, or worse. And yet, the act of trading, however dangerous, is also an assertion of life. You chew the small piece of bread you manage to acquire, tasting the irony and relief that comes with survival. Outside, the wind continues to whistle through the streets, indifferent to human struggles, yet carrying with it the muted triumphs and quiet horrors of every clandestine transaction. Night falls again. You tuck yourself into whatever warmth you can find, thinking about the absurd, ingenious, and often heartwarming mechanisms that keep people alive. Hunger dominates every action, but it also fosters creativity, cunning, and a fragile sense of community. You realize that, in this frozen, desperate city, the black market is not just commerce's lifeblood, humor, and hope wrapped into a single, chaotic system. And as sleep finally tugs at you, the shadowed alleyways and whispered deals linger. In your mind, a reminder that survival is never simple, but it is always, unmistakably human. Ration cards are the lifeblood of survival in Leningrad. You clutch yours like a talisman, aware that the small rectangle of printed paper determines whether you eat today or go without entirely. The system is strict. Stamps and allocations are monitored with military precision, and the penalty for mistakes or forgery can be severe. You shuffle through the lines, shoulders hunched against the wind, observing neighbors hand over their cards with a sort of reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. Here, bureaucracy isn't a nuisance, it's a literal matter of life and death. The process itself is painstaking. You watch as clerks stamp each card with meticulous care, cross-checking names against ledgers and occasionally arguing with colleagues over allocation errors. Historians still debate whether the rationing system, despite its rigidity, actually saved more lives than it hindered. For you, standing in line and waiting for a meager slice of rye bread, the debate is abstract. The system's authority is absolute and its influence palpable. Without that card, the world closes in. With it, you possess a fragile lifeline. Ration cards are also instruments of social order. They create visible hierarchies. Adults receive one allocation, children another, and the elderly or infirm slightly more or less, depending on shifting regulations. You notice how these tiny distinctions generate tension and negotiation. Some people attempt to use connections or clever forgeries to claim slightly more than their official allotment. Others accept what they are given quietly, adjusting daily routines around the scarcity. It's remarkable how such a simple piece of paper dictates behavior so completely. The cards themselves are curious objects, printed on thin, inexpensive paper, often adorned with faded ink. They carry a sense of official gravitas that contrasts sharply with the absurdity of the times. You remember reading about families who laminated theirs with scraps of waxed paper to prevent tears and water damage, small acts of ingenuity that speak volumes about human adaptability. You even catch yourself inspecting the card, wondering if a crease or smudge might reduce its efficacy. An instinct that is simultaneously practical and slightly obsessive every morning. You watch neighbors calculate their day based on the ration, cards, provisions. A single 125-gram loaf is divided carefully, half for breakfast, a quarter for lunch, a pinch for dinner. You notice how families supplement rations with whatever they can find, berries hidden under snow, weeds plucked from city sidewalks, or the occasional root dug from frozen soil. Even these meager additions require careful planning. Too much today, and tomorrow's survival is jeopardized. Children internalize the system early. You see them learning arithmetic, not from school books, but from ration cards, counting grams of bread, tallying weekly allocations, and comparing their share with siblings. It's a practical education in scarcity, one that no classroom could replicate. The psychological weight is immense, but the skills they acquire are life-saving. Historians still argue whether such early exposure to rationing hardened children prematurely or fostered resilience that shaped post-war Soviet society. For you observing them, it feels like a bit of both. Quirky practices emerge in households desperate to make rations last. Some families add powdered cellulose, sawdust, or crushed roots to bread dough, a practice so widespread that it becomes culturally embedded during the siege. You wrinkle your nose at the memory of those coarse crumbs, yet you understand the ingenuity behind them. These substitutions blur the line between food and survival tool, and the taste grim as it becomes less important than the nourishment it provides. Even official distribution is unpredictable. Lines can stretch for hours, and clerks may run out of stamps or miscalculate allocations. You notice how residents adapt, forming informal alliances, swapping shifts in line, or pooling cards with relatives to stretch a single loaf across multiple people. These arrangements foster both camaraderie and friction. A neighbor might resent another for cutting in, yet secretly rely on their generosity to make it through the week. It's a delicate balance, a social dance choreographed by scarcity. The weight of authority is evident everywhere. Guards patrol distribution points, ensuring rules are obeyed, ration cards checked, and line cutting discouraged. Their presence is not overtly threatening, but it is constant. You feel the tension in the air, an unspoken reminder that missteps, even minor ones, have consequences. The power dynamics extend beyond the officials. Survival itself becomes a form of compliance, a daily negotiation between human will and imposed structure. You notice the ritualistic aspect of the ration card system. Families plan meals meticulously, dividing bread into minuscule portions, often using scales or improvised measuring tools. You watch someone slice a loaf so evenly it borders on obsession. Each gram is precious, each meal a carefully calculated event, and yet there's a faint humor in the absurdity. Grown adults scowling over a 125-gram loaf as if it were a priceless artifact. The tension and the comedy exist side by side, a surreal feature of life under siege. The interplay between ration cards and black market trade is constant. If the system provides inadequately, ingenuity fills the gap. You see neighbors quietly exchanging stamps, bartering for bread, or pooling resources. It's a hybrid economist, structured yet fluid, regulated yet improvisational. Scholars still debate whether this dual system of official rationing and informal trading prolonged survival or introduced greater inequality. For you, the practical lesson is immediate. Adaptability is as critical as obedience, and cleverness can be life-saving. Every evening, you reflect on the weight of paper and the value it conveys. A single card can mean a day of survival. A misstep can cost you everything. You marvel at the paradox. In a world of extreme deprivation, something so small and fragile, printed on cheap paper, carries more significance than gold, land, or weapons. And yet, it's not just the paper. It's the combination of structure, ingenuity, and social cooperation that keeps the city alive. By nightfall, the lines have vanished, the clerk's gone, and the city quiets under a frosty blanket. You sit near a dim stove, carefully measuring your daily ration, and reflect on the strange intimacy the system creates. It forces neighbors into proximity, fosters subtle social bonds, and even, in some cases, sparks kindness and generosity. The ration card is more than bureaucracy, is a lifeline, a challenge, and a mirror of human resilience, all at once. You drift to sleep with the card tucked close, a fragile promise of bread, of warmth, of continued existence. Outside, snow muffles the streets, but inside, the calculations, negotiations, and quiet acts of ingenuity continue to hum, a delicate rhythm of life in a city frozen, hungry, yet astonishingly alive. Children bear the brunt of hunger in ways that adults often shield themselves from. You watch a young boy dragging his boots through icy slush, his fingers raw and stiff, cheeks flushed from the cold, and his body's desperate attempt to stay warm. His eyes are wide, darting toward every crumb, every discarded scrap of food, as if the city itself were a giant scavenger hunt where survival is the only prize. You realize that for these children, life is measured not in days or years, but in the calories they manage to ingest each morning. School, such as it is, exists only as a skeletal framework of pre-war routines. Some classrooms are makeshift shelters, with frost creeping along the edges of walls where children sit on benches, too small for warmth, and wait for the thin gruel that is meant to sustain them. Teachers, frail and hollow-eyed themselves, try to maintain semblance of normality. Scholars still debate whether these attempts at structured education genuinely helped children retain morale or merely highlighted the absurdity of their daily struggle. Observing the small group, you notice laughter sometimes breaking out a brief, fragile rebellion against the gnawing reality of hunger. Quirky adaptations appear everywhere. You see kids scraping snow off streets and mixing it with a pinch of powdered starch to make a cold, tasteless dough that they pretend is bread. Their small games often revolve around foraging. Who can find the largest frozen root, or a dropped piece of bread, or even a stray nut someone might have lost in the snow? It's surreal, almost comical, yet underneath the humor is a profound ingenuity. The way children negotiate scarcity is both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. Some families hide food for their children, creating secret caches in walls, under floorboards, or even inside furniture. A small tin of condensed milk might be reserved for a sickly sibling. A scrap of black bread tucked into a sleeve for breakfast. You notice how these clandestine stores are treated like treasure, their protection sometimes causing family disputes. Historians still argue whether such hoarding fostered psychological resilience or added stress to already desperate households. You sense it's a bit of both. A strange balance between care and tension. Children also become miniature participants in the broader black market economy. You see a small girl offering to run errands for an adult neighbor carrying flour, eggs, or scraps of meat in exchange for a piece of bread or some tiny token of chocolate. Even in their vulnerability, they learn early lessons in negotiation, bartering, and ingenuity. The sight is both adorable and haunting. It's a training in survival far beyond their years. You can almost see the gears of resilience turning behind their wide, hungry eyes. Play takes strange forms. On icy streets, kids turn broken sleds into wagons for carrying foraged food. A shard of wood becomes a makeshift shovel for digging up frozen roots. You notice an eerie humor in their improvisation, like a shadow puppet theater where the shadows are made of frost and famine. It's a coping mechanism, a defiance of circumstance, and a reminder that even in extreme deprivation, creativity persists. Hunger amplifies social hierarchies among children. Older siblings may control ration distribution, deciding who gets a crumb and who goes without. Sometimes the power struggles are subtle. Sometimes they escalate into quarrels, rivalries, or secret acts of generosity. Observing these interactions, you realize that food scarcity is teaching lessons about leadership, negotiation, and moral choice from a very early age. Scholars still debate whether these lessons shaped a generation into pragmatic survivors or left lasting scars on social trust. The environment outside also functions as a kind of playground, albeit a harsh and sometimes dangerous one. Children navigate icy streets, frozen canals, and abandoned buildings, learning not only about survival, but also about risk. One misstep, one icy patch, and injury could mean missing the day's rations entirely. It's a high-stakes education, and you watch with a mix of admiration and dread. Despite the bleakness, small moments of joy persist. A child finds a hidden nut and shares it with a friend. Another discovers a tiny sprig of wild herb and pretends it's a delicacy. Such gestures, trivial by peacetime standards, are profound in context. You feel that these small acts are essential to sustaining hope, even as the broader reality remains grim. They are the threads of humanity that stitch together the harsh fabric of everyday life. In families, children often observe the silent heroism of adults. Mothers ration themselves to give slightly more to children. Fathers, if present, may go days without proper food to shield offspring from starvation. You note how the intergenerational dynamic centers on protection and sacrifice, a recurrent theme throughout the siege. Quirky facts surface here too. Some children would sneak small bits of food from communal kitchens or even chew on bark or roots. Rituals that become shared stories in the long winter nights. By evening, you watch the children return home, faces pale, bodies shivering, stomachs still rumbling. Yet, in their eyes, there's resilience, a stubborn spark that refuses to be extinguished by frost or famine. Even in such extreme deprivation, they exhibit humor, inventiveness, and solidarity. They are small, fragile, yet astonishingly adaptive. As night falls, you imagine the quiet lull of these children in their tiny apartments or shared shelters, lying beneath thin blankets, clinging to whatever warmth remains. They dream of loaves of bread, of slightly less icy streets, of spring that seems impossibly far away, and you realize, painfully, that their survival hinges not only on official rationing or black market ingenuity, but on the relentless courage and creativity that only children can exhibit in the face of incomprehensible hardship. By the time you finally close your eyes with them, the wind still whistles through cracks in the walls, carrying with it the echoes of tiny footsteps, whispered games, and the faint scent of survival. Hunger remains, constant and insistent, but within these children lies a resilience that will outlast the cold, the scarcity, and perhaps even the memory of these frozen, desperate days. Women carry the burden of survival with a quiet ferocity that astonishes you. Everywhere you turn in besieged Leningrad, you see mothers, grandmothers, and sisters clutching ration cards, dragging sleds piled with kindling, or carrying children on hips that have grown gaunt from hunger. Men are often at the front, swallowed by the Red Army, leaving women to manage households, endure shortages, and make impossible decisions. You realize that in this frozen chessboard of survival, women are not pawns, they are the queens, moving in every direction, shielding families with both courage and cunning. A mother slices a single loaf of bread into razor-thin pieces, distributing them with a precision that would impress an engineer. Each crumb is weighed, measured, and accounted for. She takes the smallest portion herself, always. It's a scene repeated endlessly across the city. Historians still debate whether maternal sacrifice genuinely increased survival rates, or whether it simply postponed the inevitable for a few extra days. Yet, you can't ignore the resilience etched in these women's faces, their insistence on protecting the younger, weaker, and sicker at any cost. Quirky improvisations pepper their routines. Some women grind dried acorns or even wallpaper paste to mix into flour, stretching dough into something resembling bread. Others boil weeds or pine needles into bitter soups that, while unappetizing, provide a trickle of vitamins. You overhear a grandmother bragging lightly about her recipe for boot stew, a concoction of boiled leather scraps, softened enough to chew. The humor is grim, but it's humor nonetheless, a survival tactic in its own right. The responsibility extends beyond food. Women manage heating, childcare, and even morale. You see them patching torn coats with thread unraveled from old rugs, knitting mittens from unraveled sweaters, and scavenging wood from abandoned furniture. Firewood is so scarce that some resort to burning books or furniture legs, their choices. Loaded with symbolic weight, you imagine the heartache of tossing a beloved family book into the stove, trading knowledge for warmth. Yet, there's a practical ruthlessness that governs survival. Sentimentality has little place when frostbite threatens. Socially, women become the backbone of neighborhoods. You notice how they gather at communal kitchens, sharing not just food, but information, encouragement, and companionship. These kitchens, sparse and smoky, become informal support networks. One woman might trade a scrap of bread for a neighbor's help carrying water. Another might offer babysitting in exchange for a handful of flour. In these subtle exchanges, women sustain not just bodies, but communities. Scholars still debate how much these networks influenced survival, but watching them, you sense they were indispensable. Children naturally orbit their mothers. You watch small hands tugging at skirts, begging for morsels, and mothers soothing them with stories or songs. there's a surreal juxtaposition. Lullabies sung in freezing rooms, fairy tales told while chewing sawdust bread. Yet, the act of storytelling becomes another form of nourishment. It feeds not the body, but the imagination, keeping despair at bay. One mother whispers to her daughter that the bread is enchanted, capable of making her strong enough to last another day. The little girl believes it, and for a moment, so do you. Women also take on roles traditionally reserved for men. You see them hauling sacks of flour off supply trucks, repairing walls, or even digging defensive trenches when the front comes too close. Their resilience redefines gender roles, not through ideology, but through necessity. Quirky images stick. In your mind, a woman wielding an axe to chop frozen firewood, then immediately cradling her child with the same hands. Survival requires both hardness and tenderness, often within the same breath. There are darker realities too. With scarcity comes vulnerability. You overhear whispers about trades made in desperation, not for jewelry or coats, but for food itself. Some women barter labor, others companionship, in exchange for rations. It's an uncomfortable truth, often glossed over in official accounts, but still part of the survival mosaic. Historians argue whether these stories are exaggerated or suppressed, but the human cost of hunger often defies neat categorization. For you, walking the icy streets, it's a reminder of the blurred lines hunger creates between choice and necessity. You marvel at the mental strength required. A woman might wait in line for hours in blizzards, children at her side, only to return home with barely enough food for one meal. Yet she repeats the cycle daily, anchored by sheer willpower. Jokes occasionally slip through the grimness. A mother quips that her soup is fit for a czar, if the czar liked boiled socks. Laughter erupts, thin but genuine, proof that humor is as vital as calories. By evening, communal bonds tighten further. Women gather around weak stoves, trading recipes that no longer exist: pea pies, roasted meats, bowls of porridge. The recitations are nostalgic, almost ritualistic, feeding the soul more than the body. These imagined meals sustain morale, a reminder that hunger, while powerful, cannot erase memory or longing. You listen, caught between sadness and admiration, as they conjure banquets from thin air. Night settles, and the city grows quiet. You watch a mother tuck her children under a blanket, kiss their foreheads, and then sit in silence, nibbling the smallest crumb of bread she saved for herself. She closes her eyes, weary but steadfast, her mind already turning to tomorrow's endless calculations: how to stretch rations, how to keep the stove burning, how to keep hope alive. In the stillness, you realize that the siege is fought not just with soldiers and weapons, but with mothers and their relentless determination. As you drift into uneasy sleep, the echo of their voices lingers, measured, pragmatic, occasionally laced with humor. In a city starved of food and warmth, women create pockets of resilience, turning scarcity into structure, despair into routine, and hunger into a challenge they refuse to yield to. They are both the quiet engineers and the stubborn guardians of survival, holding families together, one crumb, one stitch, and one whispered lullaby at a time. The air in Leningrad is full of secrets, and many of them whisper through the alleys where the black market thrives. Hunger has a way of bending morality, and you find yourself walking behind shadowy figures who carry bundles beneath coats, who nod to one another at corners, and who speak in low voices about prices that sound absurd to ears used to peacetime. Here, a single loaf of bread can cost a man his wedding ring. There, a handful of potatoes might equal a fur coat. You begin to understand why people said bread was worth more than gold. Ration cards were supposed to provide stability, but everyone knows the rations are not enough. That gap between enough and survival is where the black market blossoms. You hear stories of children sent to swap family heirlooms for food, of soldiers trading bullets or boots for bread, of women exchanging services for a chunk of sausage. Historians still debate the scale of this underground economy was. It tolerated quietly by authorities or harshly punished whenever discovered. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between, veiled in both necessity and shame. Quirky improvisations define this marketplace. Some sellers peddle bread baked from sawdust mixed with flour, or meat made of ground-up animal bones. People joke grimly that you need more courage to eat black market food than to face German artillery. And yet, despite the danger of fraud, many risk it. You can almost taste the desperation in the air, thin, bitter, like overbrewed tea. You see a transaction in progress, an old woman holding out a family icon, its gold edge worn thin by years of prayer. She exchanges it for 2 small loaves, cradling them as if they were newborns. Watching her, you feel both reverence and heartbreak. A sacred object loses its place on a shelf, but gains a new role, keeping someone alive for another day. Survival redefines value, turning symbols into sustenance. The secrecy of these exchanges is theatrical. Sellers whisper passwords like they're part of a spy novel, choosing meeting places in abandoned stairwells or darkened corners of communal kitchens. Buyers approach cautiously, their eyes darting, always aware that officials might appear. Punishment for speculation, as the state called it, could mean imprisonment, but hunger makes gamblers of everyone. You wonder how many families weighed the risk and decided that prison was still preferable to slow starvation. Some transactions leave traces of humor, however grim. A man boasts he traded a winter coat for a whole bucket of sauerkraut, to eat it all in one sitting and fall ill. His neighbors laugh, though not too loudly, because laughter itself burns precious calories. The joke lingers, half warning, half comedy. Overeating can kill just as surely as famine. You notice that the black market doesn't only deal in food. Fuel, too, is a precious commodity. A single log of firewood can command outrageous prices, and neighbors sometimes trade entire family heirlooms for the promise of warmth through one freezing night. Soap matches, salt, all of them rise in value until they rival silver. Scholars still argue whether this shift represents economic collapse or adaptation. You feel it's both, the invention of a shadow economy, born of desperation. The ethical debates of this underground world follow you like an echo. Some accuse black marketeers of exploitation, preying on the weak. Others argue they saved lives by redistributing scarce resources when the state could not. You wonder if morality survives hunger at all, or if hunger writes its own moral code. In those quiet alleys, choices seem less about right or wrong, and more about alive or not alive. On one corner, a boy no older than 12 offers cigarettes for trade, though he doesn't smoke himself. He's learned the art of barter faster than arithmetic. Watching him haggle with an older man, you sense the strange maturity famine forces upon the young. The boy accepts a crust of bread in exchange, and he walks away with a grin, victorious in his small, grim marketplace. The state, of course, does not remain blind. You overhear whispers about raids, arrests, and public denunciations, yet these efforts never truly erase the black market. Hunger is stronger than fear, and so the underground economy regenerates endlessly, like a stubborn weed pushing through cracks in the pavement as the day fades. You realize you've walked through more than just a hidden economy. You've glimpsed a different way of seeing value itself. In this world, diamonds are useless, but a crust of bread can inspire reverence. You think back to that grandmother clutching her loaves like sacred relics, and you understand why people later said that in Leningrad, bread was truly more precious than gold. When you finally retreat from the alleys, your ears still ring with whispers of trades, your nose still catches phantom scents of moldy flour and boiled cabbage. You carry with you the uncomfortable truth that survival often requires not just courage, but compromise. And you wonder, as you lay down in the icy quiet of night, whether you too would trade your most cherished possession for a single loaf of bread. Factories hum faintly in the background, their smokestacks coughing weak trails into the icy sky. You walk past them and realize they aren't just buildings, they're lifelines, kept alive by workers who labor on empty stomachs. Hunger gnaws at their bellies, yet machinery still grinds, lathes still whine, and assembly lines still rattle on. In besieged Leningrad, production doesn't stop. It simply shifts into a new, surreal dimension where human endurance is stretched beyond logic. Inside, the air is heavy with oil and cold steam. Women dominate the floor now, their hands wrapped in rags against the chill, faces pale but determined. They bend over machines, stamping out shells and parts for tanks. A worker pauses briefly to catch her breath, clutching her side as hunger, cramps bite at her ribs, then resumes without complaint. You notice the rhythm: hunger, pause, resume, repeat. It's like a grim metronome, ticking the beat of survival. Historians still debate whether this heroic image of the hungry worker at her post was propaganda or reality. The truth is layered, yes. Some fainted at their machines. Yes, absenteeism grew, but yes, astonishing amounts of war material were still produced. The paradox is hard to grasp. How could a starving city still churn out weapons? And yet, you stand among the clangs and shouts, witnessing it happen in real time. Quirky adaptations become part of factory life. With electricity rationed, workers sometimes assemble parts by candlelight. To keep warm, they stuff newspapers inside their coats or huddle near engines for fleeting warmth. Breaks are brief, and lunch often means a watery soup or a ration. Biscuits shared between friends. Someone jokes that the soup is so thin it could pass through a sieve without leaving a stain. Laughter erupts, faint but genuine, and then fades back into the clatter of machines. Management struggles to balance quotas and compassion. You hear foremen pleading with exhausted crews, urging them to last another hour, another shift. Sometimes rewards come in food: an extra crumb of bread, a spoonful of porridge. These morsels serve both as currency and motivation. A spoonful of porridge becomes the difference between collapse and continuation. Watching this, you feel as though you're inside an economy powered not by rubles, but by calories. Children sometimes appear here too, carrying messages or sweeping floors. They mimic adult seriousness, their small bodies dwarfed by oversized boots. One boy pushes a cart that squeaks loudly with every turn, and the workers chuckle, calling him the little commissar of squeaks. It's a moment of levity, a reminder that even in war and famine, nicknames and jokes survive. The atmosphere shifts when air raid sirens wail. Workers don't scatter, they simply continue, some muttering that bombs can't possibly be worse than hunger. Yet the threat is real. Factories are prime targets. You crouch beside a group as distant thuds shake the walls, plaster dusting the floor like flour. When the all-clear finally sounds, no one even pauses to clean up. They return immediately to their machines. It feels less like courage and more like numb necessity. Fuel shortages add another layer of absurdity. Some furnaces run on wood scavenged from destroyed buildings. Others are kept barely alive, flickering weakly, unable to reach full efficiency. Workers improvise, constantly mending belts with bits of wire, reusing old bolts, hammering metal with tools so worn they're practically artifacts. It's industrial archaeology in motion, and somehow, against all odds, it still functions. One quirky fact sticks with you. Workers sometimes receive their wages, not in money, but in bread rations. Imagine clocking out after a shift and being handed a lump of bread instead of a paycheck. In this economy, bread is salary, bread is life, bread is status. No wonder it outweighs gold. By evening, the factory floor grows quieter. Exhausted bodies shuffle out, their movements sluggish, shoulders drooped. Yet there's a strange pride, too. Even half-starved, they know their labor keeps the city alive and the front supplied. A worker pats the machine she's been tending all day, whispering to it like an old friend, "See you tomorrow, comrade." The gesture is tender, almost absurd, but deeply human, as night swallows the city. You carry the sounds with eutheclangs, the hums, the squeaks. Factories in Leningrad aren't just producing weapons. They're producing proof of resilience, of a will so stubborn it refuses to let hunger dictate the end. You realize that while bread may be more valuable than gold here, sweat is the invisible currency that keeps the city running. And in that exchange, every worker pays a price far heavier than rubles. Night falls on Leningrad, and the city becomes an orchestra of hunger. You hear it not in music, but in the endless groans of empty stomachs, in the sighs of people lying awake on thin mattresses, in the restless shuffling of bodies too cold to sleep. Hunger doesn't rest. It lingers in every breath, tightening its grip as darkness deepens. You settle down near a stove that offers only the illusion of warmth, and you realize that here, dreams are rationed just like bread. Families huddle together, layering blankets and coats, their breath fogging in the icy air. A father whispers a bedtime story to distract his children, but halfway through, he stumbles, his mind clouded by weakness, his voice fading into a murmur. A mother picks up the tale, turning it into a fairy tale about loaves of bread that sprout wings and fly into windows. The children giggle, their eyes sparkling for a moment before drooping shut. The story may not feed them, but it buys a few minutes of peace. Quirky nighttime rituals emerge in this strange world. Some families light a single candle and stare at its flame as if hypnotized, using it to forget about gnawing stomachs. Others talk about food, lavish, endless food as if words alone could conjure a feast. A man recalls his grandmother's dumplings in excruciating detail, while his neighbor chimes in about roasted chicken and honey cakes. The conversation grows almost ecstatic, until someone jokes that they're torturing themselves worse than the Germans ever could. The laughter is faint, but it's laughter nonetheless. Sleep itself becomes a battlefield. Bodies weakened by hunger can't easily slip into rest, and when they do, strange dreams come. Historians still debate whether starvation-induced dreams were purely biological or also psychological. Visions of food, warmth, and comfort haunt nearly everyone. You imagine drifting into one of those dreams yourself, a table heavy with bread, butter, cheese, and steaming soup. But the cruelest trick is waking to find nothing waiting but a crust so thin you can see light through it. The city's silence at night is deceptive. Outside, Snow crunches under boots as neighbors shuffle to water pumps or latrines. Somewhere, a baby cries, the sound muffled quickly so as not to echo too far. Dogs bark, faintly though fewer than before, since many have already vanished into stewpots. You think about how hunger erases old bonds, pets, pigeons, even wallpaper paste, all redefined as food. It's surreal, almost absurd, but hunger has its own logic. You see individuals adapting in strange ways. One man chews on pieces of leather before bed, claiming it soothes his stomach and helps him sleep. Another collects icicles and sucks them, pretending they are sugar candy. These rituals are pitiful but oddly comforting. They remind you that humans, even in famine, invent coping mechanisms, psychological shields against despair. Curfews make the night feel like a blanket smothering the city. The streets empty quickly after sundown, the danger of being caught out to great, yet some sneak through alleys anyway, hunting for the black market, scavenging scraps, or meeting in hushed whispers to barter. Their shadows dart past windows. Like restless ghosts, you press your face to the frosty glass and feel the uncanny silence, broken only by distant artillery. Hunger, you realize, makes the city quieter than bombs ever could. Despite everything, communal bonds tighten after dark. Neighbors sometimes gather to share the smallest of meals, half a loaf split 6 ways, or a pot of watery broth passed from bowl to bowl. These midnight meals carry a solemn ritual quality, as if breaking bread even the tiniest scrap is an act of defiance against despair. Scholars still argue whether such gestures were merely symbolic, but you feel their weight. Symbolism itself sustains morale. Humor sneaks in here too. One neighbor teases another for snoring so loudly he scares the Germans away. Another laughs that she's lost so much weight she could fit into her pre-war wedding dress, if only she had the strength to stand up. These jokes, tinged with irony, float through the darkness like little lanterns. They don't erase hunger, but they make it bearable, if only for a breath. Lying in that brittle quiet, you sense the hunger itself has become a character in the city's nightly drama. It prowls through streets, slips into apartments, presses its cold hands against ribs. No one speaks of it directly, yet everyone feels it, and you too are aware of it, heavy and invisible, curling into bed with every single person in Leningrad. When you finally drift into uneasy sleep, you carry with you the weight of that silence, the flicker of candles, the faint sound of laughter struggling against despair. Hunger, relentless and patient, waits for morning, and in the darkness you wonder, how many will still be alive to face the dawn? Morning in Leningrad doesn't arrive with brightness. It drags itself in, gray and reluctant, as if even the sun is too weak to rise. You step outside into brittle air that cracks in your lungs, and the streets are lined with figures moving slowly, like shadows stretched thin. They are gaunt, bundled in patched coats, pulling sleds instead of carts. But today feels different. This is breadline day. You can sense the nervous energy buzzing faintly through the frozen streets. The breadline is not just a queue, it is a lifeline. You join it, your feet crunching on frost, and already dozens of people stand ahead, ration cards clutched in trembling hands. The line snakes around the corner, silent except for the occasional cough. People guard their spots with the ferocity of soldiers. Cutting ahead is unthinkable, punishable by scorn, shouting, or worse. Bread, after all, is survival measured slice by slice. As you wait, whispers ripple through the crowd. Rumors about today's lobs. Will they be larger? Smaller? Will they even arrive? Historians still argue about how often supply disruptions occurred and whether they were the result of logistical chaos or deliberate policy. But for those in line, the academic debate doesn't matter. Every delay feels like doom. When the ration window finally opens, the crowd surges forward a little, but order is quickly restored. You inch closer, your breath clouding in the freezing air. Ahead of you, a woman clutches her child's mittened hand tightly. The boy licks his lips, staring at the counter as if it holds a miracle. You can almost feel his heartbeat racing in his tiny chest. Finally, it's your turn. The clerk behind the counter is pale and exhausted, weighing loaves on an old scale. The bread doesn't look like bread from Pistamits, gray, dense, flecked with wood pulp, sometimes mixed with bran or sawdust. Still, when he slides it toward you, your hands tremble with reverence. This small lump could mean another day of life. You cradle it carefully, as though it might crumble if held too tightly. Quirky details surround the breadline experience. Some people sniff their loaves first, inhaling deeply, as if trying to store the smell in memory. Others tap them, listening for hollow spots that might suggest filler. A few even joke that their loaves have more character than their neighbors'. One laughing that his has the personality of a brick. The humor is thin, but it spreads down the line like warmth. The walk home with bread is a ritual. People hide loaves under coats or inside sacks, fearful of theft. Mugging over bread is rare, but desperation can spark anything. You notice one woman carrying her loaf in a baby sling, rocking it gently as if to disguise it. Another man tucks his inside his hat, walking stiffly to keep balance. These odd strategies are both practical and absurd, reflections of a world where food is more precious than dignity. Back in the apartment, the loaf becomes the centerpiece of family life. A mother cuts it into exact slices with a thread, measuring every portion like a chemist. Families debate whether to eat it all at once or stretch it across days. Scholars still argue about which strategy improved survival: short bursts of energy or steady measured intake. You watch a father insist on saving half for later, though his daughter begs for another slice. His resolve cracks, and he gives her the thinnest sliver. The look on her face is both joy and tragedy compressed into one bite. Bread is never eaten alone. It is paired with whatever scraps can be found: watery cabbage soup, a sliver of salted fish, even melted snow. The meal is solemn, but also communal. Families gather, bless the bread in silence, and chew slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a banquet. Someone jokes that chewing each piece 50 times makes it last longer, and everyone nods, half amused, half obedient. The breadline repeats tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. It is both monotony and miracle. Without it, the city would collapse. With it, the city barely endures. You sense the paradox. Bread is at once too little, and yet everything, as night approaches. You remember the breadline not just as a practical act, but as a ritual of endurance. It teaches patience, discipline, and even solidarity. Neighbors sharing scraps, children entertaining each other with silly faces while waiting. You carry the memory of that dense gray loaf into the night, knowing it represents more than calories. It represents defiance, survival, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow might still arrive when you finally lie down. The taste lingers in your mouth, taste at once bitter, heavy, and priceless, and you realize, with quiet certainty, why bread is the city's true treasure, worth more than gold, more than jewels, more than anything else in a world carved thin by hunger. The city survives not only on bread and ration cards, but on whispers of hope drifting in from the frozen countryside. You walk with a group of weary men and women, their sleds creaking over the ice, and you realize they are scavengers, citizens turned hunters of roots, twigs, and anything remotely edible. Outside the city walls, nature is both enemy and ally, stingy with its gifts, unforgiving in its dangers. The countryside looks desolate. Fields once filled with rye and barley now lie under thick blankets of snow, barren and silent. Villages are gutted, their barns stripped, livestock long since slaughtered. Yet still, people venture here, scraping frozen soil with bare hands, searching for turnips left behind, or kernels of grain spilled months ago. You crouch beside one woman who triumphantly unearths a shriveled potato the size of a coin. Her smile is radiant, as though she's discovered buried treasure. Quirky improvisations define these foraging trips. Some carry spoons tied to sticks, using them as makeshift shovels. Others wear boots stuffed with straw, muttering jokes that their new fur lining keeps them warm. One man boasts he can sniff out frozen carrots like a hunting dog. His friends laugh, though not too loudly, because laughter burns energy they can't afford to waste. Historians still debate how effective foraging really was. Did it meaningfully contribute to survival? Or was it mostly symbolic, giving people the illusion of control when rations failed? Walking among these scavengers, you sense the answer is both. A handful of roots won't stop starvation, but it might provide just enough calories to tip the scales. Enough hope to keep going another day. The countryside offers dangers to German patrols, occasionally lurk beyond the lines, and scavengers risk capture or worse. Wolves prowl the forests. Drawn by the smell of weakness, even nature itself can betray in ice cracks underfoot. Icy winds slice through rags. Frostbite takes fingers before you can even notice. Still, people come. Hunger outweighs fear every time. Some make entire journeys for firewood alone. You watch men dragging logs on sleds, their bodies bent like question marks under the weight. The wood will be divided carefully back home, burned sparingly, splinter by splinter. In these expeditions, calories are traded for warmth, the currency of survival shifting again. One man jokes that his log is worth 2 loaves and a wife's forgiveness, and the others chuckle, shaking their heads at the absurd bargains. Hunger invents. The desperation pushes people to strange extremes. Bark is stripped from trees, ground down, and mixed into soups. Grass seeds are collected in summer and hoarded like jewels. Some even chew sawdust, swearing it helps fill the belly, if not the soul. The recipes are absurd, but each one tells a story of stubborn defiance humans refusing to starve without a fight. You encounter families working together, children gathering twigs, grandparents sorting edible weeds from poisonous ones, parents carrying the heaviest loads. These moments feel almost pastoral, like distorted echoes of pre-war harvests. Except now, the harvest is meager and grim frozen nettles, bits of bark, wild herbs dug from beneath snow. Yet still, there's cooperation, laughter, even the occasional song hummed to keep rhythm. At night, when scavengers return to the city, the scene becomes ritualistic. Bundles are unwrapped like sacred offerings. A small root is washed carefully, sliced thin, and shared among 5 people. A stick of firewood is displayed proudly before being placed into the stove. The objects are tiny, the gestures enormous. Each fragment becomes proof that survival is still possible, that effort still matters. Scholars argue endlessly about whether these trips were rational. Why spend more energy walking miles through snow than the calories a potato could provide? But when you watch the relief on a mother's face as she serves her children something, anything, you realize rationality isn't the right lens. Hunger isn't just about math, it's about morale. The countryside, barren as it is, gives people the illusion of agency. And that illusion feeds them almost as much as the roots themselves. As you lie down in your icy shelter, you think of the frozen fields and skeletal forests outside the city. They are stripped bare, yet still they provide. Not abundantly, not generously, but enough to keep people moving forward. One twig, one potato, one bundle of bark at a time. Hunger may rule the city, but beyond its walls, scraps of nature whisper back, not yet, tonight. You've seen citizens trading ration cards. You've trudged with them through snow to forage bark and weeds. But now you find yourself in a dimly lit apartment where something feels heavier in the air, something unspoken. A family sits around a table, eyes darting not at one another, but at the small tin dish in the center. Inside isn't bread, not even potato. It's something more unsettling, boiled scraps of dog meat. This is the stage of hunger when survival forces choices that once seemed unthinkable. Pets, once companions, once beloved, become food. At first, people resisted. Cats curled by stoves, dogs wagging their tails in the courtyards, pigeons fluttering across the rooftops. These were friends, not meals. But as bread shrank to crumbs and ration lines grew endless, the boundary blurred. You watch a young boy cradle his cat, whispering words of comfort as his parents argue quietly in the corner. The tension is not about love, it's about calories. One parent insists they cannot do it, the other reminds them the child will starve. The boy doesn't understand that his pet has already been traded in secret, bartered for a handful of flour. The empty basket in the corner tells the story. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Diaries suggest it happened often, especially in Leningrad. Yet Soviet propaganda at the time kept it silent, ashamed of what survival demanded. Some scholars argue it was universal. Others believe it was the last resort for only the most desperate. But walk these streets at night, and you notice the silence, where once dogs barked, where once cats prowled. Absence becomes its own evidence. Even animal fodder, the oats, bran, and pellets, once meant for horses, transforms into human meals. Soldiers guarding supply depots sometimes turn a blind eye, letting civilians sneak away with small sacks of feed boiled down into gruel. It tastes bitter, gritty, but still fills a stomach. Children wrinkle their noses, calling it porridge with teeth. One woman laughs at the phrase, even as she chews carefully to avoid splinters. Humor becomes seasoning when nothing else exists. Others grow creative. You stumble upon a communal kitchen where women experiment with recipes. Dogs stew with bark, garnish pigeon broth with nettles. They name dishes half seriously, as though joking makes them easier to swallow. A man compares his dinner to the finest restaurant in Moscow, and everyone chuckles, even though their bowls are half empty. Pretending helps. Pretending makes hunger sting less. Still, there's guilt. A girl cries herself to sleep after realizing her rabbit, once her playmate, is now stew. Parents reassure her, saying the rabbit wanted to help them survive, that it was an act of love. Stories become balm, disguising grief. The next morning, she eats her portion in silence, knowing there are no more rabbits. Scholarly debate lingers here too. Was eating pets a shameful necessity, or a testament to adaptability? Some historians point out that in rural villages, animals were always partly functional dogs, guarded cats, caught mice, and sometimes, in famine, they provided calories. But in cities, where pets had become companions, the act felt like betrayal. In private diaries, survivors confess to lifelong guilt, haunted by the memory of eating their own dog, or watching neighbors trap pigeons with nets. Hunger ended meals, but never erased the sorrow. The scarcity twists relationships further. Pigeons, once symbols of peace, now flutter nervously as nets rise in courtyards. Horses, those proud beasts of transport, are slaughtered when they collapse. From exhaustion, their meat divided among workers. Even rats are hunted with sticks, their bodies boiled into thin soups. You gag at the thought, but then watch a mother lick the pot clean, unwilling to waste even the smallest drop of protein. Despite the horror, camaraderie sometimes survives. You hear stories of neighbors who secretly fed one another's pets, hiding them during inspections, protecting them until the siege ended. Others risked their rations to keep a single dog alive, believing that loyalty mattered more than calories. These moments of compassion shine like lanterns in the dark, proof that not all bonds broke under hunger's grip. And then there are the jokes, grim, yes, but essential. Someone quips that the cats have all joined the partisans. Another mutters that pigeons are the most patriotic birds, flying straight into the pot. Humor dulls the sharp edge of reality. Without laughter, the silence would crush them. As you curl up that night, the city feels emptier. Streets are quiet, courtyards barren. The absence of barking dogs and meowing cats is a silence louder than bombs. It's a reminder that survival has its costs measured not just in hunger, but in the breaking of companionship, in the rewriting of what food even means. And still, people live. Still, they swallow their sorrow with every spoonful, because tomorrow demands it. You've watched families barter, forage, and even consume what once seemed unthinkable. But here's another layer of survival that feels more secretive, more whispered hidden stores and secret pantries. In a city where every gram of bread is recorded, rationed, and often stolen, a stash of flour or a tin of sugar is like buried treasure. And just like treasure, it must be hidden with care, because discovery can mean more than embarrassment. It can mean confiscation, arrest, or even death. You follow a man into his apartment. He shuts the door, checks the hallway, then lifts a loose board under his bed. There, in the dark cavity, rests a cloth bundle. He unties it with trembling hands, and inside lies a tiny hoard, a few lumps of sugar, 2 crusts of bread hardened into stone, and a sliver of salted fish. His wife sighs with relief at the sight. Tonight, they'll soften the crusts in water, share them with their children, and save the sugar for when spirits sink lowest. Historians still argue about whether hoarding was selfishness or strategy. On one hand, hidden food meant others went without. On the other, without stashes, families couldn't bridge the gaps between ration days. Some survivors insisted they hoarded, not out of greed, but out of sheer terror, that gnawing fear that tomorrow the bread line would fail, that the ration card would be lost, or that the depot would run dry. The methods of hiding food were ingenious. Flour was packed into pillowcases and slept on, giving sweet dreams a literal meaning. Butter was buried in jars beneath sheds, frozen solid until needed. Dried peas were sewn into coat linings. Even tea leaves, precious as gold, were tucked into hollowed-out books. One woman wrote in her diary that she kept her sugar wrapped in a sock because no thief ever wants a dirty sock. It worked. Her stash survived the entire siege, but secrecy cuts both ways. You hear stories of neighbors denouncing one another, accusing families of hoarding while others starved. Sometimes it was envy, sometimes desperation, sometimes simply paranoia. A knock on the door could mean inspectors demanding to search cupboards and attics. Families learned to act hungry even when they weren't, to perform misery as camouflage. If a child slipped and mentioned a hidden loaf, danger followed swiftly. The stakes could be deadly. There are accounts of people killed by neighbors who discovered their hoards. Others describe entire stashes seized by police and redistributed or consumed by soldiers who claimed official duty. The line between law and theft blurred in those days, just as the line between survival and betrayal blurred among civilians. Still, some hoards became lifelines. A grandmother might produce a single lump of sugar on a child's birthday, dissolving it in hot water to create a cup of happiness. A father might dig up a hidden jar of sauerkraut during the darkest week, announcing it like a festival feast. These moments weren't just about calories. They were about morale, about proving to one another that the war hadn't erased kindness, that family still meant celebration, even in famine. And there were odd hoards too, strange objects kept as if they were edible. One diary describes a boy who hid a tin of shoe polish, believing it to be chocolate. Another man stashed spices, though he had no food to season. His explanation was simple. One day, bread will return, and I will want it to taste good. His little jar of pepper became a symbol of faith that normal life would come back. In the countryside, hidden stores took another form. Buried cellars. Peasants dug deep pits under barns, concealing potatoes or beets from both German requisition squads and Soviet inspectors. Sometimes entire families huddled around these stores like dragons guarding gold. When soldiers discovered them, confrontations erupted, shouts, tears, sometimes even violence. Hunger turned every potato into a weapon, every sack of grain into contested ground. Scholarly debate lingers here too. Some argue hidden food represented a failure of the collective spirit, proof that desperation broke Soviet ideals of sharing. Others counter that hoarding was itself an act of resilience. Without it, more would have died. You walk through these homes, see the loose boards, the hollow walls, the jars buried in snowbanks, and you realize the debate misses something. It wasn't about ideology, it was about survival, plain and raw. At night, when families unwrap their hidden crusts in secret, there's a mix of shame and relief. They whisper blessings over the food, cross themselves, or murmur thanks to fate. The crumbs are tiny, but the ritual is immense. It feels almost sacred proof that, against all odds, they've managed to outwit both hunger and authority, at least for tonight. And as you lie down again, you imagine all across the city thousands of hidden stores, beneath floorboards, inside coat pockets, under snowdrifts. Each stash is a heartbeat, pulsing in the dark, keeping people alive until dawn. The secret pantries of Leningrad may have been small, but they carried the weight of entire lives. The city is hungry, but salvation must come from beyond its frozen walls. You rise before dawn and join a line of weary workers trudging toward the railway depot. Snow crunches underfoot, but the real weight pressing on everyone's shoulders is anticipation. Will the trains arrive today, or will the tracks stay empty, silent as the grave? Hunger in Leningrad and across the Soviet Union wasn't just about rations, it was about logistics. Grain fields in Ukraine and the Volga region lay in ruins, burned by retreating armies or seized by advancing ones. Railroads, lifelines of food transport, were shattered by bombs and artillery. The few trains that still ran carried not only supplies, but also soldiers, weapons, and the wounded. Bread competed with bullets, and bullets usually won. You climb onto a platform where a locomotive wheezes in the distance. Its paint is scorched, its wheels stiff with ice. Workers swarm around it, hacking frozen couplings loose with hammers. One man mutters a joke. Even the trains need ration cards to move. The others laugh grimly, then bend their backs harder. When trains do arrive, they carry precious cargo, sacks of flour, barrels of oil, sometimes even tinned meat from the Far East. But unloading is chaos. Civilians hover nearby, pretending to watch, secretly hoping for a spill. When a sack bursts open, people dive to the ground, scraping handfuls of flour into their pockets, uncaring if it mixes with dirt or snow. You see, one woman licked the snow itself, desperate not to waste even a grain. Historians still argue whether the Soviet transport system was heroic or disastrous. On one hand, millions of tons of supplies did eventually reach starving cities. On the other, inefficiency, corruption, and sabotage wasted enormous amounts. Some claim trains sat idle for days while paperwork shuffled between offices. Others insist the miracle was that anything moved at all, considering how often German bombers targeted the tracks. One detail often overlooked: the drivers. Train engineers became unsung heroes, guiding heavy locomotives through frozen landscapes, often with frostbitten fingers on the throttle. They shoveled coal with numb hands, sometimes substituting wood when coal ran out. There are stories of drivers falling asleep from exhaustion, only to be shaken awake by their comrades as artillery. Shells exploded nearby. Yet they kept moving, because if the train stopped, so did thousands of lives. Then there's the road of life, the frozen route across Lake Ladoga. In winter, when rail lines failed, convoys of trucks skated across the ice, carrying flour, sugar, and fuel into the city. You join one such convoy in your mind, the headlights dimmed, the engines rattling. The ice groans beneath you, cracking like a drumbeat. Soldiers whisper prayers. Everyone knows trucks have sunk before, swallowed whole by the black water, but still they drive, because behind them lies a city where bread has become more precious than gold. Quirky details pop up even in this grim theater. To lighten loads, drivers stripped doors off their trucks and left them on the shore. Mechanics joked that if you needed spare parts, just fish them out of the lake. Children on the city's edge waited for convoys, cheering each truck as though it carried Santa Claus himself. One soldier carved tiny figurines from frozen flour, handing them out like toys before collapsing from exhaustion. And yet, despite all these efforts, the trains and convoys never brought enough. You imagine standing in a bread line the morning after a delivery. Hundreds of people, some leaning on crutches, others pulling children on sleds, all shivering as they wait for a ration that might already be gone. Bread trucks roll in, loaves, measured on scales with bureaucratic precision. A clerk shouts names, and the line inches forward. Somewhere near the back, people murmur prayers that their turn won't come too late. Scholars debate whether the state could have done more. Could they have allocated more trains, diverted more supplies, or built better storage? Or was the scarcity simply inevitable, given the scale of war? The arguments still rage, but to those waiting in the snow, debates mean little. What matters is whether the train arrives, whether the convoy crosses the ice, whether the next day will bring flour to turn into bread. As you curl up again in your cold corner of the city, the The rattle of trains echoes faintly in your memory. They sound like iron lungs, breathing life into a starving body. The rhythm of wheels on tracks becomes a lullaby, not because it's soothing, but because it carries with it a single promise. Tomorrow, perhaps, there will be bread. Morning frost hangs in the air, and once again you find yourself standing in a line that stretches down the block, curling around corners like a frozen serpent. This is the bread line, the theater of survival, where patience and desperation collide. Everyone knows the script. You shuffle forward, clutching your ration card like a talisman, and pray the bakery window doesn't slam shut before your turn. The line itself is a social world. Neighbors whisper gossip, children whimper with cold, old men argue about politics, and strangers share the latest rumors about what's really inside today's loaves. Some swear it's mostly sawdust, others claim potato peelings. A woman jokes that at least the loaves are half fiber, great for digestion. The man beside her laughs bitterly. If only we had anything left to digest. Bread lines test more than patience, they test civility. Some days, the waiting fosters camaraderie. People swap stories, trade tiny comforts like matches or buttons, and lean on one another when legs tremble. An old woman collapses, and instantly hands reach out, lifting her up, whispering encouragement. Someone gives her a place ahead in line. In that moment, hunger softens into compassion. But on other days, tension sparks. You hear shouts when someone suspects a neighbor of cutting in. Fists clench when a worker from a factory gets priority, as the state often gave them. Mothers glare when soldiers pass by and are handed loaves first. Bread, after all, isn't just food, it's hierarchy, politics, and power in edible form. Historians still debate how much social trust survived the breadlines. Some memoirs recall warmth, solidarity, and shared suffering. Others speak of bitterness, betrayal, and endless suspicion. Diaries even tell of friendships formed in line, where people saw each other daily, bonded over complaints, and joked that they were neighbors in hunger. But there are also records of theft, of cards stolen straight from hands, of children sent to distract clerks while parents tried to cheat the scale. You shuffle forward, inch by inch, until finally the bakery window looms. Inside, workers move, briskly, slicing loaves, weighing them on rusted scales, stamping ration cards. The bread looks dark, dense, more brick than food. Still, the smell wafts out, intoxicating, almost dizzying. A man ahead of you stares at his portion in disbelief, muttering, "This is all." But then he tucks it under his coat like treasure, as though afraid someone might snatch it away. Quirky details abound here, too. People developed rituals for carrying bread home, wrapping loaves in scarves, tucking them into boots, even strapping them to their bodies' undercoats. One woman describes cradling her loaf like a baby. Others couldn't resist mumbling crusts on the walk home, only to arrive with half a portion and regret heavy in their stomachs. Children, especially, were guilty of this, their faces dusted with crumbs as parents sighed in frustration but said nothing. Bread itself wasn't equal. Workers in vital industries often received larger rations than the unemployed or the elderly. Soldiers, families sometimes got priority. This hierarchy sparked endless debate. Was it fair to feed those who kept the factories alive? Or was it cruel to leave the weakest with the smallest crumbs? Historians still argue whether rationing was just or simply utilitarian. But to those in line, fairness didn't matter as much as survival. At times, the bread didn't come at all. A rumor spread down the line that deliveries had been delayed, or that the flour shipment had been bombed on its way in. Groans rippled through the crowd, some people stomping away in despair, others clinging stubbornly to hope. A few camped overnight, convinced tomorrow would bring loaves. Imagine sleeping in the snow just for the chance of crumbs. That was the reality. Yet the line was also a stage of resilience. People sang songs softly to keep warm, hummed old lullabies, or recited poetry under their breath. Children played little games, sliding on the icy pavement, giggling despite their hunger. Even in the bleakest moments, life pushed forward stubbornly, like weeds cracking through concrete dot. As you step away with your own crumbly ration clutched to your chest, you realize bread lines were more than distribution points. They were of war revealing who helped, who hoarded, who cheated, and who endured. They exposed both the ugliest and the noblest instincts, all compressed into the simple act of waiting for bread that night. Lying in your cold bed, you imagine the line still winding through the city, people shuffling endlessly toward the hope of nourishment. The bread line is both nightmare and lifeline, cruel yet essential. And as you drift to sleep, the murmur of the waiting crowd becomes a lullaby, reminding you that in this war, even standing in line is an act of survival. The bread lines may be the visible face of hunger, but behind them hums another machine, the propaganda engine. You wander past a wall plastered with fresh posters, their colors shockingly bold against the drab gray of the city. A worker, smiling broadly, raises a loaf of bread high like a trophy. Beside him, slogans scream in red ink. Bread is victory. Sacrifice today for triumph tomorrow. The image feels surreal when you know that people just down the street are fainting in line for their meager rations. Propaganda didn't just shape morale, it shaped how people thought about hunger itself. Newspapers insisted that shortages were temporary, that everyone was sharing equally, that the enemy alone was to blame. On the radio, upbeat voices urged citizens to endure with patience, to tighten belts proudly as proof of loyalty to the motherland. Hunger was transformed into patriotism, a duty rather than a disaster. Historians still debate how much people believed these messages. Some argue propaganda provided real comfort, giving meaning to suffering and convincing citizens they were part of a larger struggle. Others believe most people saw through it, muttering curses under their breath as they scraped bowls of watery soup. Perhaps both. Our true belief shifted day by day, depending on whether you had eaten that morning. Quirky details reveal how far the system went. Pamphlets suggested creative recipes using substitutes, bread made with sawdust or linseed oil, soup from nettles and wallpaper paste. Posters showed smiling children holding bowls of healthy herb soup, though in reality, those herbs often came from weeds scraped off roadsides. At one point, officials declared nettles a patriotic vegetable, sparking jokes that even weeds had joined the party. Propaganda also targeted emotion. You pass a poster showing a soldier on the front, his bayonet gleaming, while behind him, his family at home shares a loaf of bread. The caption reads, "He fights, you endure together, you win." The message is clear. Complaining about hunger is disloyal, selfish, even treacherous. Survival isn't just personal, it's political. At rallies, speakers thundered that endurance was proof of Soviet superiority. "The fascists may have tanks," one speech declared, "but we have bread made of iron." The crowd cheered, though you notice some clapping with trembling hands, too weak to lift their arms fully. The theater of enthusiasm masked the theater of hunger. Scholars note that propaganda wasn't only down. Ordinary citizens often participated, writing slogans in chalk. reciting verses about endurance, or staging tiny performances of loyalty. Teachers instructed children to draw happy families at the dinner table, even if their own cupboards were bare. The drawings hung in classrooms like talismans, fragile shields against despair. Yet cracks always appeared. In private diaries, citizens mocked slogans, twisting them into bitter jokes. One man wrote, "Our bread is victory, but the victory belongs to the bread, because it conquers us all." Another quipped that posters should read, "Sacrifice your stomach for mustache." Humor again became a survival tactic, even against words painted 10 feet high. The most haunting aspect is how propaganda shaped memory. Survivors later recalled feeling both pride and resentment. Pride that they endured for the motherland. Resentment that their suffering was glossed over, turned into cheerful posters. Even now, historians argue whether propaganda was manipulation or medicine, whether it exploited suffering or kept people alive by giving them a story to cling to. As you walk past the last poster, the wind peels its corner away from the wall. The smiling bread loaf flaps in the cold air, a paper ghost mocking reality. Behind it, the gray brick is bare, cracked, and cold, just like the stomachs of those who pass by. You retreat into the dim light of an apartment where a family gathers around a flickering radio. A voice announces proudly that harvests are improving, that supplies will soon overflow. The family nods silently, though you can see their eyes, tired, skeptical, but desperate to believe. Belief itself is sustenance here, fragile and fleeting. That night, lying in your thin blanket, you hear the echo of slogans in your head, words painted in bright red. Bread is victory. You wondered if propaganda kept people alive, or did it only teach them to starve quietly? The question has no answer, only the whisper of paper posters flapping in the wind. The walls of the city echo with slogans and the gnaw of empty stomachs. But then comes a faint rumble, not of German artillery this time, but of something far away from across oceans. You picture crates being loaded in New York, Boston, or Houston, stamped with bold letters, Lend-Lease, to the USSR. For the first time in months, the idea of food arriving from beyond the horizon feels possible. Allied aid wasn't just weapons and trucks, it was calories. Trains rattled from Murmansk down into the Soviet interior, loaded with flour, sugar, condensed milk, spam, and tins of American meat. Imagine the shock of opening a metal can to find bright pink meat swimming in its own gelatin, a product that became legend spam, the mystery meat that tasted like salvation. Soldiers joked they could fight an entire battle fueled only by spam sandwiches, though in truth, many civilians never saw it, as most cans were reserved for the front. Still, the supplies filtered through. Children in Leningrad tasted raisins for the first time, sticky and sweet, like tiny jewels after months of bark soup. Condensed milk was diluted with water and passed around, thick and sugary, a dessert for a starving family. Flour arrived in sacks so large they seemed like miracles, though often guarded tightly by soldiers. One quirky story tells of children cutting the English words from the sacks and sewing them into doll clothes. Survival stitched itself into even the smallest scraps. Historians debate how much Allied aid truly mattered. Soviet officials at the time downplayed it, insisting the motherland stood on its own. Later, some argued that without Lend-Lease, Soviet cities would have collapsed entirely. The truth likely lies in between. It didn't erase hunger, but it bent the arc of survival just enough to keep millions alive. The convoys that carried these supplies were legendary in their own right. You imagine being aboard a British or American ship, cutting through the icy Arctic seas, loaded with canned goods, tanks, and boots. The northern lights flicker above, while German submarines prowl below. Sailors called them the suicide runs, knowing that a torpedo could turn their cargo and their lives into wreckage within seconds. Yet they sailed anyway, driven by the knowledge that every crate meant another family, another soldier, another city clinging to life. In the Soviet countryside, Allied trucks rolled in, painted olive green, sturdier and faster than the local. Models, drivers, grinned as they rumbled through villages, and children chased after them, laughing, shouting for sweets. Sometimes, soldiers tossed candy bars out the back, sparking a scramble as kids dove into the dust. For a moment, hunger turned into joy, and chocolate became the taste of hope. But aid had its quirks too. Powdered eggs, confused families who had never seen them. Tins of peanut butter baffled cooks who tried to fry it or stir it into soups. American cheese appeared in bright yellow blocks, so rubbery that people joked it could patch boots. Some embraced these strange foods, others mocked them, but no one doubted their importance. Foreign calories meant another day survived. There's still scholarly debate about the balance of pride and gratitude. Did Soviet leaders downplay aid to protect national honor, or was it genuinely less vital than domestic production? Survivors' diaries tell a different story. They remembered the first taste of Spam, the first handful of raisins, the first tin of condensed milk. To them, aid wasn't abstract, it was tangible, edible, unforgettable. You sit with a family as they open one such can, a rare prize obtained through a relative working in a depot. The children peer inside with wide eyes. The father slices the contents carefully, giving each person a tiny square. They chew slowly, savoring the strange taste, both foreign and miraculous. For once, no one jokes, no one complains. They eat in silence, honoring the gift. That night, as you lie down, the echo of distant oceans feels closer. You imagine ships cutting through waves, convoys pushing across ice, crates being unloaded onto snowy docks. The world beyond the Soviet Union has reached through hunger to offer a lifeline. The food may not be abundant, but its presence is undeniable proof that even in the darkest winter, help can arrive from far away. By now, hunger is no longer just a physical ache, it's a cultural weight pressing down on every detail of daily life. You drift through a cramped apartment where 3 generations crowd into one room, the air thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Every conversation circles back to the same theme: food. Who has it? Who doesn't? Who might trade a scrap tomorrow? Hunger has become the grammar of existence. Mealtime rituals, once ordinary, now carry deep symbolism. A family gathers around a chipped wooden table. The mother ladles thin soup into each bowl, careful to divide it equally. Even the act of scraping the bottom of the pot feels ceremonial, a sacred moment of fairness. To eat together is to survive together, and each spoonful carries more weight than gold coins. Quirky details color these moments. In some apartments, people kept a bread safe, a locked tin box, because theft, even by hungry relatives, was not uncommon. In Leningrad, survivors later recalled how the smell of freshly baked bread could make entire stairwells fill with whispers. As neighbors guessed who had managed to get flour, one child wrote in her diary that she dreamt of bread so often she could taste the crust in the morning air. Historians still argue about how families balanced solidarity with desperation. Some accounts emphasize remarkable selflessness, giving their entire ration to children, siblings refusing to eat until the weakest had taken their share. Other testimonies reveal darker truths: quarrels, stolen scraps, even betrayal. Hunger, after all, strips away layers of civility. Perhaps both extremes existed side by side, the same family showing compassion one day and suspicion the next. Clothing, too, became entangled with survival. Belts were tightened, literally, not just metaphorically, as bodies thinned. Winter coats grew looser, sleeves hung longer, and neighbors joked grimly that hunger was the best tailor. Old boots were patched again and again, sometimes with strips of cardboard or cloth soaked in tar to keep out the snow. Families bartered heirloom jewelry, not for gold, but for wool socks or a pair of mittens. Yet even in this bleak landscape, small rituals of dignity endured. Women still styled their hair with scraps of ribbon. Men still polished worn shoes before parades. A wedding might feature no feast, only black bread and weak tea, but vows were spoken all the same. In these moments, people clung fiercely to culture as armor against despair. Daily work routines also reflected hunger's grip. In factories, workers moved slowly, weakened by rations, yet posters demanded higher production. Some managers allowed bread breaks, tiny pauses where workers nibbled crusts brought from home. School children, too, recited lessons while clutching crumbs in their fists, terrified of losing even a morsel. Quirky anecdotes survive of teachers, rewarding top students not with medals, but with an extra spoonful of porridge. The emotional toll was immense. You overhear a grandmother humming lullabies, not to help a child sleep, but to distract them from hunger pains. Families told fairy tales of magical feasts, not to entertain, but to soothe. One story often repeated was of a giant table in the sky where ancestors prepared endless meals, waiting for the living to join them someday. Food became not just survival, but a metaphor for hope, for heaven, for endurance beyond the present. Scholars still debate whether these cultural rituals truly lessened suffering or merely masked it. Was sharing stories of feasts a psychological coping mechanism that preserved sanity? Or did it cruelly sharpen the sense of deprivation? Diaries and oral histories leave both interpretations open. You sit quietly in the apartment as the family finishes its meal. A single crust remains hard and stale. The father breaks it into tiny pieces, giving each person one, saving nothing for himself. They chew slowly, the sound of teeth on crust loud in the silence. Then, almost ritualistically, the mother wipes the table clean, as if erasing hunger itself for the night. When you finally lie back on a makeshift bed, you realize the truth. Hunger has reshaped not just stomachs, but entire ways of living. Every act, eating, working, telling stories, even getting dressed is filtered through scarcity. Food is not merely food. It is ritual, culture, memory, identity, and in the Soviet Union of World War II, it has become the very currency of life itself. You've followed hunger from breadlines to battlefields, but now the war drags on, and with it comes a strange, dangerous economy and underground world where food becomes more valuable than rubles, more valuable even than loyalty. You step into a shadowy courtyard where a man waits with his coat pulled tight, glancing nervously over his shoulder. In his pocket, a single loaf of bread worth more than gold. The black market thrived because official rations could never be enough. Farmers in the countryside sometimes hid small amounts of grain from requisition officers, smuggling it into cities at night. Housewives whispered about connections, relatives who could procure butter, sugar, or flour always at a steep price. You'd think jewels or money would dominate these trades, but often it was barter, a pair of boots for a sack of potatoes, a wedding ring for a bottle of sunflower oil, a fur coat for a few pounds of flour. One quirky detail stands out. Cigarettes, even for non-smokers, became currency. A carton could buy a loaf of bread or a jar of honey. Coffee beans, when they appeared, were practically mythical, traded almost like relics. Some even bartered with labor-mending clothes, chopping wood in exchange for food. Hunger turned every skill, every possession, every gesture into part of the survival economy. Historians debate whether the black market saved lives or corrupted society. On one hand, it provided food where the state could not, quietly feeding millions who might otherwise have starved. On the other, it deepened inequality. Those with valuables to trade survived, while the poor, stripped of everything, fell behind. Official propaganda condemned the black market as treasonous, yet everyone knew someone who relied on it. Survival rarely obeys ideology. You creep through an alley where two women lean close, trading whispers. One produces a paper-wrapped bundle flour. The other presses into her hand a silver spoon, dull but still gleaming faintly. They part quickly, eyes darting, because punishment for black market trade was harsh. Police raids could strip a family of everything, even send them to prison, and yet the trades continued. Because hunger does not wait for permission. There's a strange energy in these markets, almost theatrical. Sellers hawk onions or chunks of meat like carnival barkers, their voices low but insistent. Buyers circle, warily, pretending indifference until they spot something they can't resist. Children are sent to linger on corners, listening for rumors of who has butter or sugar. Some families grew adept at scavenger hunts across the city, chasing whispers like treasure maps. Quirky humor even crept in. One Leningrad diary recalls a woman saying she invested her last rubles in potatoes, joking that they held their value better than Soviet bonds. Another man declared himself a millionaire because he had a pocket of sunflower seeds, laughing as he cracked them one by one. Dark laughter, yes, but laughter nonetheless. You imagine sitting in a candlelit apartment where a clandestine trade is taking place. The curtains are drawn. A neighbor brings in a small jar of honey. In return, he receives a gramophone record, an object once cherished, now surrendered to hunger. The family savors the honey carefully, spooning it onto stale bread, golden sweetness melting across their tongues. For a few minutes, the world feels rich again. Scholars still argue about how pervasive this underground economy was. Some claim it was marginal, only supplementing official rations. Others insist it became the true backbone of survival, especially in besieged cities. Perhaps, like everything else in wartime, it depended on chance, connections, and luck. As you step back into the night, the alley feels alive with invisible trades, with whispers of flour and oil, with coins clinking and jewelry changing hands. The official slogans outside scream about equality and sacrifice, but in the shadows, hunger has its own market, its own laws, its own ruthless fairness, and in this hidden economy, bread really is worth more than gold, not because it shines, but because it keeps a heart beating one more day. The war begins to tilt. News filters in slowly, cautiously, that the Red Army has pushed the Germans back at Stalingrad. Victory is whispered like a prayer, yet hunger still sits at every table, a guest who refuses to leave. You walk through a city square where the snow is melting, revealing muddy cobblestones. People cluster in groups, murmuring about the future. Their stomachs are still empty, but something in the air has shifted. Hope, cues remain, but the lines are shorter now. Rations increase slightly, enough that bread no longer feels like myth but reality again. Factories buzz with cautious optimism, and though workers are still gaunt, their movements seem lighter, as if they believe survival is possible. You pass a bakery where fresh loaves emerge from the oven. The smell drifts into the street, drawing wide-eyed children like moths to flame. The miracle is not abundance. There is still so little, but the promise that the famine might end. Historians debate whether recovery was quick or painfully slow. Some argue that Allied aid and liberated farmland rapidly improved food supplies. Others point out that hunger lingered into the late 1940s, shadowing lives long after the guns fell silent. What everyone agrees on is that bread remained the central symbol of survival. For many, their first full slice, after years of deprivation, was the true taste of victory. Quirky details reveal how deeply this shaped culture. Weddings after the war often featured loaves of bread piled high, not as luxury, but as defiance. Look, we survived. We feast now. Soldiers returning from the front carried tins of Spam or American chocolate as gifts, cherished more than medals. Children born in these years often bore nicknames like Kortoshka potato or Klabushka, little bread, proof that food had fused into identity. You sit with a family at their table, where for the first time in years, bowls are filled, not with watery cabbage soup, but with chunks of meat, slices of bread, even a smear of butter. They eat slowly, reverently. The grandmother weeps as she tastes butter for the first time in nearly a decade, whispering, "This is life." The children laugh, their cheeks rounder now, their voices less brittle. Hunger has not vanished, but it has loosened its grip. The open question remains, was the suffering necessary? Did shortages harden the Soviet spirit, forging resilience that crushed the Nazi invasion? Or was it simply cruelty, an avoidable tragedy compounded by poor planning and harsh policies? Historians still argue. You are left in the silence of the kitchen, watching butter melt into bread. Knowing the answer may never be clear. The story of bread being worth more than gold lingers, not just as history, but as metaphor. In war, value flips upside down. Gold cannot be eaten. Diamonds cannot fill an empty stomach. A single crust of bread, though dry, hard, crumbly, can mean the difference between despair and another sunrise. And that truth is something survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives. Now, as night deepens, you feel the narrative slowing, softening. The sounds of war fade into the background, replaced by the quiet murmur of families at tables, chewing slowly, whispering thanks, holding each other a little tighter. The journey quiets now. Imagine the Soviet night sky, wide and endless, scattered with faint stars above rooftops and chimneys. The city is tired, but it breathes. People lie down in cramped apartments, in barracks, in shelters, each one carrying stories of bread and hunger, of survival against odds so heavy they seemed impossible. Let your mind drift to the faces you've seen, the children with crusts clutched in small fists, the workers faint but still hammering in factories, the grandmothers humming lullabies to soothe empty bellies. Their stories don't end with the war, they ripple forward, shaping families, shaping memories, shaping what bread means even decades later. Breathe in slowly. Picture the soft, steady rhythm of a spoon stirring soup, of hands breaking a loaf, of quiet voices sharing the smallest portions with reverence. These sounds and gestures are as much a part of history as battles and speeches. They are the heartbeat. Beneath the headlines, the truth hidden in kitchens and queues. Now imagine the war fading away, not with explosions, but with silence. Silence that grows as front lines shift, as hunger slowly loosens its grip, as bread becomes something ordinary again. Ordinary, but never forgotten. Close your eyes and picture a table. Upon it sits a single loaf, fresh and warm, steam rising faintly in the cool air. Around it, people gather not, starving now, but smiling, their voices gentle. The war is over, the hunger has eased, and for once, bread is just bread again. And as you rest tonight, may you carry that quiet image with you, a reminder that even in the darkest times, survival can blossom into peace, and hunger can give way to fullness. By now, hunger is no longer just a physical ache, it's a cultural weight pressing down on every detail of daily life. You drift through a cramped apartment where 3 generations crowd into one room, the air thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Every conversation circles back to the same theme: food. Who has it? Who doesn't? Who might trade a scrap tomorrow? Hunger has become the grammar of existence. Mealtime rituals, once ordinary, now carry deep symbolism. A family gathers around a chipped wooden table. The mother ladles thin soup into each bowl, careful to divide it equally. Even the act of scraping the bottom of the pot feels ceremonial, a sacred moment of fairness. To eat together is to survive together, and each spoonful carries more weight than gold coins. Quirky details color these moments. In some apartments, people kept a bread safe, a locked tin box, because theft, even by hungry relatives, was not uncommon. In Leningrad, survivors later recalled how the smell of freshly baked bread could make entire stairwells fill with whispers. As neighbors guessed who had managed to get flour, one child wrote in her diary that she dreamt of bread so often she could taste the crust in the morning air. Historians still argue about how families balanced solidarity with desperation. Some accounts emphasize remarkable selflessness, giving their entire ration to children, siblings refusing to eat until the weakest had taken their share. Other testimonies reveal darker truths: quarrels, stolen scraps, even betrayal. Hunger, after all, strips away layers of civility. Perhaps both extremes existed side by side, the same family showing compassion one day and suspicion the next. Clothing, too, became entangled with survival. Belts were tightened, literally, not just metaphorically, as bodies thinned. Winter coats grew looser, sleeves hung longer, and neighbors joked grimly that hunger was the best tailor. Old boots were patched again and again, sometimes with strips of cardboard or cloth soaked in tar to keep out the snow. Families bartered heirloom jewelry, not for gold, but for wool socks or a pair of mittens. Yet even in this bleak landscape, small rituals of dignity endured. Women still styled their hair with scraps of ribbon. Men still polished worn shoes before parades. A wedding might feature no feast, only black bread and weak tea, but vows were spoken all the same. In these moments, people clung fiercely to culture as armor against despair. Daily work routines also reflected hunger's grip. In factories, workers moved slowly, weakened by rations, yet posters demanded higher production. Some managers allowed bread breaks, tiny pauses where workers nibbled crusts brought from home. School children, too, recited lessons while clutching crumbs in their fists, terrified of losing even a morsel. You've followed hunger from breadlines to battlefields, but now the war drags on, and with it comes a strange, dangerous economy and underground world where food becomes more valuable than rubles, more valuable even than loyalty. You step into a shadowy courtyard where a man waits with his coat pulled tight, glancing nervously over his shoulder. In his pocket, a single loaf of bread, worth more than gold. The black market thrived because official rations could never be enough. Farmers in the countryside sometimes hid small amounts of grain from requisition officers, smuggling it into cities at night. Housewives whispered about connections, relatives who could procure butter, sugar, or flour always at a steep price. You'd think jewels or money would dominate these trades, but often it was barter: a pair of boots for a sack of potatoes, a wedding ring for a bottle of sunflower oil, a fur coat for a few pounds of flour. One quirky detail stands out: cigarettes, even for non-smokers, became currency. A carton could buy a loaf of bread or a jar of honey. Coffee beans, when they appeared, were practically mythical, traded almost like relics. Some even bartered with labor-mending clothes, chopping wood in exchange for food. Hunger turned every skill, every possession, every gesture into part of the survival economy. Historians debate whether the black market saved lives or corrupted society. On one hand, it provided food where the state could not, quietly feeding millions who might otherwise have starved. On the other, it deepened inequality. Those with valuables to trade survived, while the poor, stripped of everything, fell behind. Official propaganda condemned the black market as treasonous, yet everyone knew someone who relied on it. Survival rarely obeys ideology. You creep through an alley where two women lean close, trading whispers. One produces a paper-wrapped bundle flour. The other presses into her hand a silver spoon, dull but still gleaming faintly. They part quickly, eyes darting, because punishment for black market trade was harsh. Police raids could strip a family of everything, even send them to prison, and yet the trades continued. Because hunger does not wait for permission. There's a strange energy in these markets, almost theatrical. Sellers hawk onions or chunks of meat like carnival barkers, their voices low but insistent. Buyers circle, warily, pretending indifference, until they spot something they can't resist. Children are sent to linger on corners, listening for rumors of who has butter or sugar. Some families grew adept at scavenger hunts across the city, chasing whispers like treasure maps. Quirky humor even crept in. One Leningrad diary recalls a woman saying she invested her last rubles in potatoes, joking that they held their value better than Soviet bonds. Another man declared himself a millionaire because he had a pocket of sunflower seeds, laughing as he cracked them one by one. Dark laughter, yes, but laughter nonetheless. You imagine sitting in a candlelit apartment where a clandestine trade is taking place. The curtains are drawn. A neighbor brings in a small jar of honey. In return, he receives a gramophone record, an object once cherished, now surrendered to hunger. The family savors the honey carefully, spooning it onto stale bread, golden sweetness melting across their tongues. For a few minutes, the world feels rich again. Scholars still argue about how pervasive this underground economy was. Some claim it was marginal, only supplementing official rations. Others insist it became the true backbone of survival, especially in besieged cities. Perhaps, like everything else in wartime, it depended on chance, connections, and luck. As you step back into the night, the alley feels alive with invisible trades, with whispers of flour and oil, with coins clinking and jewelry changing hands. The official slogans outside scream about equality and sacrifice, but in the shadows, hunger has its own market, its own laws, its own ruthless fairness, and in this hidden economy, bread really is worth more than gold, not because it shines, but because it keeps a heart beating one more day. The war begins to tilt. News filters in slowly, cautiously that the Red Army has pushed the Germans back at Stalingrad. Victory is whispered like a prayer, yet hunger still sits at every table, a guest who refuses to leave. You walk through a city square where the snow is melting, revealing muddy cobblestones. People cluster in groups, murmuring about the future. Their stomachs are still empty, but something in the air has shifted. Hope cues remain, but the lines are shorter now. Rations increase slightly, enough that bread no longer feels like myth but reality again. Factories buzz with cautious optimism, and though workers are still gaunt, their movements seem lighter, as if they believe survival is possible. You pass a bakery where fresh loaves emerge from the oven. The smell drifts into the street, drawing wide-eyed children like moths to flame. The miracle is not abundance. There is still so little, but the promise that the famine might end. Historians debate whether recovery was quick or painfully slow. Some argue that Allied aid and liberated farmland rapidly improved food supplies. Others point out that hunger lingered into the late 1940s, shadowing lives long after the guns fell silent. What everyone agrees on is that bread remained the central symbol of survival. For many, their first full slice, after years of deprivation, was the true taste of victory. Quirky details reveal how deeply this shaped culture. Weddings after the war often featured loaves of bread piled high, not as luxury, but as defiance. Look, we survived. We feast now. Soldiers returning from the front carried tins of Spam or American chocolate as gifts, cherished more than medals. Children born in these years often bore nicknames like Kortoshka potato or Klabushka, little bread. Proof that food had fused into identity. You sit with a family at their table, where for the first time in years, bowls are filled, not with watery cabbage soup, but with chunks of meat, slices of bread, even a smear of butter. They eat slowly, reverently. The grandmother weeps as she tastes butter for the first time in nearly a decade, whispering, "This is life." The children laugh, their cheeks rounder now, their voices less brittle. Hunger has not vanished, but it has loosened its grip. The open question remains, was the suffering necessary? Did shortages harden the Soviet spirit, forging resilience that crushed the Nazi invasion? Or was it simply cruelty, an avoidable tragedy compounded by poor planning and harsh policies? Historians still argue. You are left in the silence of the kitchen, watching butter melt into bread. Knowing the answer may never be clear. The story of bread being worth more than gold lingers, not just as history, but as metaphor. In war, value flips upside down. Gold cannot be eaten. Diamonds cannot fill an empty stomach. A single crust of bread, though dry, hard, crumbly, can mean the difference between despair and another sunrise. And that truth is something survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives. Now, as night deepens, you feel the narrative slowing, softening. The sounds of war fade into the background, replaced by the quiet murmur of families at tables, chewing slowly, whispering thanks, holding each other a little tighter. The journey quiets now. Imagine the Soviet night sky, wide and endless, scattered with faint stars above rooftops and chimneys. The city is tired, but it breathes. People lie down in cramped apartments, in barracks, in shelters, each one carrying stories of bread and hunger, of survival against odds so heavy they seemed impossible. Let your mind drift to the faces you've seen, the children with crusts clutched in small fists, the workers faint but still hammering in factories, the grandmothers humming lullabies to soothe empty bellies. Their stories don't end with the war, they ripple forward, shaping families, shaping memories. shaping what bread means even decades later. Breathe in slowly. Picture the soft, steady rhythm of a spoon stirring soup, of hands breaking a loaf, of quiet voices sharing the smallest portions with reverence. These sounds and gestures are as much a part of history as battles and speeches. They are the heartbeat. Beneath the headlines, the truth hidden in kitchens and queues. Now imagine the war fading away, not with explosions, but with silence. Silence that grows as front lines shift, as hunger slowly loosens its grip, as bread becomes something ordinary again. Ordinary, but never forgotten. Close your eyes and picture a table. Upon it sits a single loaf, fresh and warm, steam rising faintly in the cool air. Around it, people gather not, starving now, but smiling, their voices gentle. The war is over, the hunger has eased, and for once, bread is just bread again. And as you rest tonight, may you carry that quiet image with you, a reminder that even in the darkest times, survival can blossom into peace, and hunger can give way to fullness.